Scholars, welcome to Chapter 2 of Computer-Mediated Communication. Today we're going to be talking about the technologies that we use for computer-mediated communication and the people that use those technologies. Getting right into it, let's start with one of the fundamental things that really we've become a sort of an assumed necessity of computer-mediated communication, the internet. It's the thing we all use, we all connect to, we all have this really deeply embedded every day in our lives, but what the heck is it? So to start there, really fundamentally, the internet is a network of computers. The internet is really just this complex system of computers all tethered together. It started off as literally just two computer systems and now consists of millions and millions and millions of more. And really the internet, as we sort of loosely refer to it, really just now refers to that infrastructure, the increasingly complex infrastructure of connecting devices together. And together, these devices form networks of thousands and millions of devices in today's society. The reason we needed this, though, was not necessarily to play Fortnite or Call of Duty. Rather, the need for the internet came up in the wake of World War II. Following World War II, we'd seen a lot of damages to infrastructures, particularly our communication infrastructures. In the middle of battle, being able to get information from the front lines to the home front and vice versa was really important. The problem was the way that our networks and our infrastructure was set up. So let's take a little bit of a look at what was going on in the wake of World War II, and specifically the missiles. In the wake of World War II, we saw increasingly with both the United States and the USSR, now Russia, in a standoff in the Cold War, basically pointing intercontinental ballistic missiles at each other. The problem with this, beyond the missiles themselves, was what happens if we're attacked. This is a very US focused problem, because in the United States we had the city of Chicago and to a lesser degree St. Louis. Now Chicago, St. Louis, and also Denver served really important roles in the telecommunication infrastructure of the United States coming out of World War II. Specifically, these were centralized nodes in the communication networks of the infrastructure of the United States. In other words, any message trying to go from coast to coast, so from New York to Los Angeles, from Seattle to Washington, D.C., all those systems got routed, all the communications got routed through the hubs in Chicago. What this means was, from a defense standpoint, were the USSR to send a missile and bomb Chicago, the obliteration of Chicago, not only would we lose the Cubs, we would lose any ability for transcontinental communication. This is really problematic. So the figures that you see on your screen, on the left, we have that centralized network where all the communications are going through one particular key hub. And increasingly, the United States, as we entered into the Cold War, was looking to decentralize and hopefully distribute the way that communication went. In other words, no longer did you have to go through Chicago, or did you have to go through either Chicago, St. Louis, or Denver, but rather communication could flow myriad of different ways. It could go from Chicago to Duluth and down. It could go from Jacksonville to Austin, and then to San Diego. And the more we could distribute the network of our communication infrastructure, the more robust and resilient it was. So this idea of decentralizing our communication network infrastructure and ultimately creating a vastly distributed network was the genesis for what was to become the internet. These days, the internet is a connection of everything, and it's no longer just computers hooked together, but all the smart devices we have, from our cars to our home appliances to our smart devices, garage door openers or refrigerators. So many things are connected to the internet and creating the internet. Again, it's just those connections of devices, and no longer do they have to be just tabletop computers. But when we think of the internet now, we often aren't thinking of the infrastructure of our air conditioner system. We really think about the tethering of those computers. More critically, when we think about the internet, we often aren't thinking about the actual infrastructure, the fiber optics, the microwave channels, the satellites that make up the internet. And often when we talk about the internet, what that's really a short code for is some of the services that run on top of the internet. So if the internet is that infrastructure, there's many, many services that use the infrastructure and run on top of the internet to allow us to communicate. So things like the World Wide Web, which we'll talk about in a moment, was just a graphical interface to allow us to share information. Anytime you log into a web browser, you're logging onto the World Wide Web. But so too is email. You may get to email through a World Wide Web client, but you may just open the email service on your phone or on your computer and not have to go through the internet at all. File transfer protocol is another very common one that we use. If any of your friends use some sort of torrenting service to perhaps share movies or games or videos, they're using file transfer protocols. It's just another system that runs on top of the internet. So when we talk about the internet, really what we're often alluding to is some service that uses the internet, but it is worthwhile to take a moment and talk about the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web, again, is just a system that runs on top of the internet, creating and connecting information, and we can really divide the World Wide Web as we know it into three fundamental stages. The original web, Web 1.0, was really developed in the mid-'80s. It was very much a read-only device, something that you were going to log onto and consume the information on it. Anyone could have a web page, but many of the web pages were dominated by organizations, commercial systems, etc. But certainly personal websites could exist. And often, whether it was a person or corporation creating that information, it was creating a website that could be consumed by others. You might be looking at web pages. Interactivity there meant clicking on the links to browse through the websites that you've connected to each other. But it wasn't terribly interactive. The interactive web, Web 2.0, became known as a social web because it was not only about reading, but also about writing. So when we get to things like social media, that's really indicative of the rise of Web 2.0 and the social web, because now it wasn't just about reading what other people had put on the website, but rather we could generate the content as well. And we would focus on things like sharing content, interacting with the content providers and other content creators. And this is not just in the sense content creators in the sense of influencers online, but rather anybody who's making a post was a creator. Towards the late 90s, we started to see the rise of Web 3.0, which has become known as the semantic web. And the semantic web is best known for using algorithms, using the computer systems themselves to create links between information. Whereas Web 1.0 sort of leaned on the original author to create those links. Oh, I think this idea is related to this other one, so I will create and embed a hyperlink in the website to show you this related site. Web 2.0 allowed other users to do it, say, oh, you might want to check out this site. Here's a link. In Web 3.0, the computer systems provide those links. One of the places we sort of see this poorly demonstrated probably is either Netflix or Amazon recommendations. Oh, you enjoyed watching this movie. Oh, you looked at this product. Other users, based on their behaviors who looked at this movie or product, also are interested in this. And so it's going to direct you over there, not based on what Jeff Bezos or any particular head of Amazon thinks or Netflix thinks, but rather what this algorithm, what the computer system thinks. So it's going to look a lot more at behaviors, sort of big data, trying to understand large amounts of user data, and in doing so, create new links in the website algorithmically rather than by individual users or large conglomerates of users. So we've seen the World Wide Web, which again is an application that lays on top of the internet, grow and expand. And now we've got billions of web pages accessible to us. One of the challenges with this is we think about the internet and we think about the World Wide Web. Often we, and I mean this as you, the viewer, and you, the student, and myself, when we talk about internet access, we talk about it as this assumed thing. Everyone has the internet. You're watching this now on a screen, on a computer, possibly on a smart device, either a tablet or a phone. I'm recording this on a computer with a webcam. Sitting next to me is a personal computer. I've got a phone. I've got a tablet. We've got devices all around. Many places we go, from our homes to our schools to our work, are enabled with hotspots and wireless internet. We think of internet access now as this sort of presumed thing. But it's really important to remember that it's not. And that's where the digital divide comes in. And the digital divide is a term that was coined to talk about the difference between those who had access to digital technologies and information communication technologies and those who did not. because we really understand that those who don't have access to or don't have meaningful access to digital communication technologies can't engage in the world that you and I may engage in the same way. These can be very big to very small things. If you don't have a computer, if you don't have internet access, you can't watch a YouTube video. If you're looking to fix a car part and just say, oh, I'm going to pull up a YouTube video to show me how, you can't do that if you don't have the internet, if you don't have a device to watch it on. As we'll talk about in a moment, though, the digital divide has grown to include some other things as well. So let's talk about the digital divide, and we'll talk about the three phases of the digital divide that have been identified thus far. The first level digital divide deals with access, and this is just a matter of those who can and those who cannot access the internet and information communication technologies. There's several reasons that individuals might not be able to have access to computer technologies, CMC, etc. The first of which is geography, and I mean this in a couple different ways. One of the ways geography can impact things is topography. The actual way your land is configured can really affect whether or not we can run the infrastructure needed to get the internet access into your area. So for example, if you're living in a very mountainous area, running fiber optic lines over the mountains or tunneling, boring through the mountain to provide access is really costly. Whereas if you're in farmland or flat areas, much less so. Ultimately, in really rural areas, those that are remote, low population density, it's just not as cost effective for a lot of the telecommunication companies to provide internet services in those really remote areas. If you can spend the same time and effort and provide internet access to 1 million people in a large urban area or 6 people in a rural farmland, that choice is for the telecommunication company is going to be pretty simple based on the economics. The second part about internet access is sociodemographics. We often think about the haves and have-nots, and we think about, oh, well, countries in the Western Hemisphere and first world nations have a lot better internet access, which is true. But even in these areas, we still see the first level divide. One of the ways we saw this really laid bare during the COVID-19 pandemic was as individuals were going to libraries, to sitting outside Taco Bells, trying to get access to do online or remote school work. And so this is an image of 2 kids that were sitting outside of a Taco Bell where their parents had set them with their school-issued laptops to do the schoolwork because they didn't have internet access at home. If you're living in New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, New Delhi, London, internet access is let me rephrase, those areas are wired for internet access, but it doesn't necessarily mean you have it. In your high-rise apartment, there may be hundreds of Wi-Fi signals, but if they're not open, if no one's giving you the access code, you can't access them. So even in large urban areas, we still have individuals that don't have access to the internet. Either they don't have the devices due to economic concerns, they don't have the internet connectivity, or both. And so this isn't just a rural-urban divide, but rather lots of divides within that. As a result, we see lots of differences, particularly geographically, on who has access to the internet. And so when we think about many developed countries, from Canada to the United States, Western Europe, Australia, Japan, internet access is getting better, and we have sort of high 70s to high 90s% of the population with internet access somehow. But particularly when we get into sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Southwestern Asia, Central America, internet access in a meaningful way is much, much less. So when we think about the digital divide, when we think about the fundamental issue of who has access and who doesn't, it's really important to understand that only in the last 3 or 4 years has 50% of the world's population been able to get online. There are currently billions of internet-enabled devices and billions of internet-enabled users. But globally, only about 51 to 52% of the population right now has their own personal internet access. So the first level divide, as much as we think of it in our own personal networks, of course everyone has the internet. It's really important to remember that's not a global or even a local truth for many of us. The last thing I'll bring up about the first level divide, we've increasingly, particularly in countries like the United States or Singapore or Australia, seen a little bit of a shift in the focus of what does access mean, from having access to a computer to having quote unquote meaningful access. And what that meaningful is there to do is reflect that in most of these areas, even in rural areas or remote areas, there's some way to get on the internet. The greatest example of this is the library. Most public libraries have internet-enabled public terminals set up for individuals to come in and use. However, that's not necessarily meaningful internet access in the sense of you can't do the same things in a library that you can do at home. Now, I know where your head immediately went, but let's back up a step. Even things like paying bills, checking medical records online. There's a big difference sitting in the privacy of your own home or even a cubicle at work and looking up your health history and having to do so either only being able to reserve the internet computer for 30 minutes and then having someone behind you literally looking over your shoulder waiting their turn, or just having to do all this in a public place where you access your bank account and have to have everyone in the library potentially see how little money you have. Maybe you're a communication professor. I don't know. But so this idea of, yes, well, of course you live in the United States, you have access, there's a library nearby. That's true, but that's not the same level of access one gets sitting in the privacy of their own home where they can browse the internet and all of the things that are on it at their leisure. Now, for those that do have home internet, high-speed internet with some sort of computing technology, then we get into the second level divide. And the second level divide is about ability. So you have internet access, but you may not be able to use the technology in the ways that either you want to or society wants you to. So one of the places we often see this, and it's a little bit of a stereotype, is often older adults have a hard time using computers. So for example, many cities, many utilities are now switching where you have to go online to do everything from pay bills to resolve complaints. If you have a computer, but you're not really comfortable using it or don't want to interact with people that way, all of a sudden going online to book an appointment, check your medical records, pay a parking ticket, vote, whatever, if you don't have high computer use skills, that may be a real challenge for you to do so. And so you have the technology to do so, but not the ability to do so. The other end of this is an interesting phenomenon where individuals may think they have the ability because they have high self-efficacy. They have a high belief that they are capable of doing this thing, when in fact their self-efficacy doesn't actually match their ability. And we actually see this with younger generations. College students are notoriously bad at this. You as digital natives have grown up with technologies and around computers, and often think that you can do a lot of things. When we ask about the self-efficacy of computer use and technology use, college students tend to self-report very highly. And yet, they're often challenged in the ways they actually use things. So Flanagan and Metzger, for example, found that individuals have high self-efficacy, college students have high self-efficacy for searching for information on the internet, even though they only about 20% of the time go to a second page of a Google result. Something as simple as, if it's not showing up on the first page, it must not exist and the answer must not be there. Clearly that's not true. They're not trying different search terms, going to the second page, thinking of synonyms, etc. They just assume it doesn't exist on the internet. So there's an example of high self-efficacy. Very personally, I was working one time in a professional communication course. We were building up resumes. And so we're sitting in a computer lab and all of my college students that I'm working with are working away on their word processors, and a student raises their hand and says, "Can you help me with this?" And they're having problems formatting multiple columns in the resume, which I understand. Word is not always a user-friendly thing. The irony was, though, what they were asking for help with was aligning the columns for skill proficiencies, and the first one listed there was highly proficient in Microsoft Word. And the student didn't quite get the irony in that the challenge that they were facing, not being able to typeset that column, actually demonstrated they weren't as proficient in Microsoft Word as they thought. And so when we talk about this ability causing the second level divide, it can really manifest in two ways: not having the ability or overestimating the ability that you may not actually have. But this is another form of the digital divide that even once we overcome, getting you an information communication technology can still divide populations. Once you have the technology, once you're able to use the technology, that's when we get to the third level digital divide. And this is your willingness to use the technology, the desire to use the technology. There are individuals that have internet access and still just don't want to use it. So I'm with the boomers on this first one. One of the biggest concerns we have, where we have the technologies, we're capable of using the technologies, and we just don't want to, is our privacy. So increasingly, sort of as part of the movement for being environmentally conscious, restaurants are increasingly, when you sit down, rather than having paper menus, they'll have you scan a QR code. My thing is, I value my privacy, and I realize when you have a QR code, it can send your smartphone anywhere, do anything for your smartphone. The fastest way to lose your privacy is scanning a random QR code that directs you to a site with a virus where all your information is downloaded. So again, I'm with the boomers here. I have a smartphone, I have a QR reader. I'm not going to use this to scan some rando QR code sitting on a table, hoping I'm going to get your menu. I just want a paper menu. Just give me that. So there's reasons we may have the technology, know how to use that technology, and not want to use it, such as privacy. One of the other challenges we increasingly see is overload. We have the technology, we know how to use the technology, but there's so much of it, we just at some point kind of hit the mental wall and say we don't want to. One of the places we see this is increasingly in K-12 schooling. There are so many apps and programs both students and parents have to monitor on a daily basis. This causes a lot of problems. It causes overload. And at some point, they just sort of say, enough. I know I've had this with my own kid. They're in school, and I've got to have one app to download their class progress, one for attendance, one to talk with a teacher, one for monitoring, one for report cards, one for the school district. And at some point, I just opted out. And this is not because I'm some Luddite. It's just because there were so many channels to keep track of, in something that really should have been funneled down into something as simple as a report card or an email home if there's a problem. So the three levels of digital divide: we have the simple access to it, we have our own knowledge and ability to use it, and then we have to have willingness to use it. Again, these three levels are important because it's only until we get past all three levels that we can really take advantage of all of the things that CMC lets us do. If you and I want to send an email to correspond, we've both got to have devices. We both got to have an email account. We both got to know how to use them. And lastly, we both have to want to do so. And if we don't have the willingness to take the time or to have an email address and use an email client, we're not going to use it. When we don't have that meaningful willingness to use access to information communication technologies, there's a lot of things we lose out on. Not being able to be online or not being willing to be online can make us miss everything from potential job postings that we would want to apply to, the ability to apply to that job. Decreasingly, employers send out a paper app and say, send it back to us. They want you to apply online. Oh, go to the website. But if you have to do that when you're sitting in a library, it's a lot more challenging. So we have a lot of things that we just have to be online to participate in. Everything from our education, civic responsibilities, and even our personal correspondences. And so bridging these three levels of the digital divide becomes really important, because in order to have those advantages of CMC, you have to be able to have access, the ability to, and the willingness to use those technologies. So that's sort of the big picture of how do we use the internet? How do we decide what to use? With so many communication technologies at our disposal, which ones do we use, and then how do we use them? One way to think about this is the social information processing model. Now, let me warn you a couple of things here. First of all, there's a different social information processing model in psychology and youth education about how kids form and process information. This is why citations are important. That's not the folk model. If you look it up, make sure you get the right one. Secondly, later on in this course, we're going to be talking about the social information processing theory. That's Walther's 1992 theory. Again, different thing. So this is our social information processing model from Falk and colleagues in 1987. And what the social information processing model set out to do was explain how individuals use information technologies. Now, this was developed in an organizational context, how do organizational members use technologies, but we've since seen it used elsewhere. The core of the social information processing model really can be distilled down into two things. How we use a particular channel or information technology is guided by two things: what the channel actually does, its objective properties and advantages, and then the social patterns or the social discourse and dialogue around its use. So let me show you really briefly what the actual original postulation of the social information processing model was. So at the very left here, we have the objective characteristics of the media, which informs the perceived characteristics of the media, which informs our attitude towards it, which in turn informs our use. We also have our own objective requirements, and then the perceived things we need to do with it, and then our own preferences. This is pretty complex and it's sort of a lot of multi-stage process. We can distill this down though into something a little simpler. The social information processing model says how we use a medium and whether we use a medium is really defined by what it actually does and then the social dialogues and social patterns around it. So take, for example, a calendar app. There's lots of calendar apps out there. Some are better than others. Some have more robust features, some are more streamlined, some have really great user interfaces, some of them interface with other programs such as email really nicely. They all have their own objective properties. And you'll pick to some degree your calendar based on the objective properties of that. But also there are social patterns. So when you're at work, the way that you use a calendar, or the calendar that you use, is guided in part by the calendar's properties. It's also guided in part by what people in your workplace talk about that calendar. So for example, you may be using Microsoft Teams to do a bunch of scheduling stuff. And Microsoft Teams has advantages, it has shortcomings, but the way that people talk about it and the way that your coworkers talk about it is also going to influence how willing you are to use Microsoft Teams, when you're willing to use Microsoft Teams, for what you're willing to use Microsoft Teams. One of my favorite sort of anecdotes of this, one of my first research studies, I looked at how a school district was using instant messenger in the workplace for work stuff. And so I went and talked with a lot of teachers and I asked them, how do you use this instant messaging in the workplace? And across the board, they all said, we love it, we love it, we love it. It's really helpful if I need to send Billy down to the office. I can get a message from the office saying Billy's needed down here, send a message back that he's on the way. The office can send a message down, Billy's arrived. And all of this without having that disturbing PA public announcement coming over. Can you send Billy to the office? At which point every kid in every class and every culture goes, ooh. You skip all that and it can be much more discreet. So the teachers loved it. And then I said, great, so how often do you use it? And they said, we don't use it. And I went, why? Why don't you use this thing that you just told me is so wonderful? And they said, because the technology, in addition to letting us send this message, shows when we're using our computer or not. There's a little red light, green light. It's set next to our username. When we're using our computer, it glows green. When we're not, it glows red. That gives the people we're connected with a sense of, are we available to talk? The problem, said the teachers, was they perceived that principals, superintendents, the administration in general, was watching what they were doing through that green light, red light phenomenon. And any teacher who was sitting, whose light was green, they assumed, the administration assumed, were just sitting there on their computers rather than dealing with their students. Now, in reality, that light could be green because the teacher was developing lesson plans. Students were engaged on the computer playing a learning game, watching a video, doing something very educational. So the green light, red light didn't have any correlation with what they were doing online, just that they were doing something on the computer. And yet they felt like administration was watching them. And this is what they told each other. This is the sort of social pattern of creating the discourse around the device. And they would get together for drinks after school on Fridays, and over their root beers talk about, oh yeah, I love this tool, but I don't use it much because the principal's watching us. Toward the end of my data gathering, I interviewed the principal and I interviewed the superintendent. And at the end of them, I brought this up and I said, here's some of the things that teachers have expressed to me as concerns. Are you really monitoring them? And without fail, all of them said, oh gosh, no, we don't care. We don't have the time. That's not our problem. And so here's this tool that objectively the teachers thought was great and beneficial, but they weren't using because of the social patterns and social pressures from their peers. And so this became a real great case study for me of the social information processing model at work. In the same way, if you remember back, or maybe you don't, Facebook and MySpace were out about the same time. MySpace was kind of an objectively better platform. It would let you do more, it let you customize more, and while that had some irritations, being able to customize and play with and mod out your social media profile was a pretty cool thing. Why Facebook won out in that war was in some ways because Facebook was the cool place to be. Facebook had a really brilliant launch where they started in the Ivy Leagues and then the public Ivies and then colleges and built up this sort of desire to be in this walled garden place. And through slowly rolling it out from universities to colleges to high schools to anybody, created this really desirable place to be. And so even though MySpace was kind of a better platform, Facebook was the place that people thought was cool. The same thing has sort of led to the decline of Facebook. You probably don't use Facebook for much more than maybe checking in with family from time to time. It's because it opened up and now parents and grandparents and family members and church members and whoever else is on Facebook. You don't spend as much time there, and you may have moved on to TikTok or Instagram or whatever technology it is you use. Part of that's because of the objective properties of whatever that platform is, TikTok, Instagram, whatever. But more critically is what your network, where your friends are. And you will always tend to shift to whatever new social media platform your friends are on, irrespective of what the platform itself can objectively do. And so that social information processing model in a nutshell is there's what the channel can do, but that only gets us so far. The other part of what we use and how we use it is dependent on the social actors around us. Now, social information processing model leads us a little bit into how we actually use these technologies. One of the theories I love to explain how we use technologies is something called adaptive structuration theory. And the short of adaptive structuration theory is that there are two ways that we can use technologies and devices. We can use them faithfully, the way that they were intended, the way that they were developed, the explicit purpose the designers had for their creation, or we can use them ironically. We can use them in unintended ways. We can create new ways. We can meme and adjust and shift the ways that we use those technologies. Sort of a clear example of this is the Facebook like button. And I say Facebook like button, but this also works for upvotes and favorites and thumbs up and whatever else one-click positive social media platform tool you have. But if you look at most of these, the like button, the favorite, the faithful use of these is to articulate, I like that. I have some sort of affection for the content of the post that was made. That's the way that they were designed. That's the way that that button is explicated. If you go into Facebook or Twitter or whatever and look up the definition of the like button, they say use this button to acknowledge that you appreciate the content. And so we use the like button faithfully when there's content like a picture of a cute puppy and a kitten, because I don't care how small your heart is, that's adorable. You like that, don't you? Smash that like button. Cool. That's a faithful use of the like button. Where we get into the ironic use of the like button is that post where grandma has died. One of your friends posts, Meemaw passed quietly in her sleep that evening, and you hit the like button. I don't think you actually click that like button happy that Meemaw has passed on. Rather, what you're doing when you click that like button, you're not literally liking the death of a friend's grandmother. Rather, you're expressing some sort of solidarity, or that you've seen it, or that the network is supporting them and they're all there for your friend in this tough time. You're using it ironically. You don't literally like that grandma has passed, but rather you're using it as a means of social support, maybe to bookmark it, to come back later and remind yourself to send them a note or write them a card or find information for a funeral or a wake. But whatever it is, you don't literally like that grandma has passed on. That's an ironic use of that technology. And so again, back to my prior example of the school and the green light, red light monitoring system. The faithful use of that green light, red light was to know when people in your network were online and were therefore maybe more available and readily able to chat. I have a quick question about lesson planning. Who's online right now and free to talk? There's a green light next to them. I'll talk to them. The ironic use was thinking it was being used for some sort of monitoring and time tracking. That's not how that was intended, even though you could sort of co-opt it to be used that way. And so when we talk about how do we use these our CMC devices and tools, there's a lot of ways to conceptualize this, but one of the simplest and yet most effective is really whether it's being used for the purposes for which it was intended or for something else. Ultimately, today's discussion has been about the internet and its users. The United Nations Human Rights Council recently recognized that access to safe discourse online and the internet is increasingly human right, even though we've only recently passed the 50% of the world's population able to get on the internet. Increasingly, we recognize the number of things we need the internet to do to be able to function in sort of modern society is necessitating internet access as a right. And so it's important as we go on, we'll talk more about CMC and its users and its uses as if everyone in the world has the internet and everyone in the world has these devices and the means and the wherewithal and the ability and the self-efficacy to do that. The important thing and the important caveat to have in the back of our brains as we discuss this is that that's not always true. And it's not always true for the people in your town. It's not always true for the people in your classroom. And it's certainly not true as a global phenomenon. And so as more and more users get online and are able to engage in those big global dialogues, it's going to be beneficial, but we're still working to get there. So don't stop thinking about this. There's a lot of ways to think about the things we've talked about today and sort of keep integrating them into your own life. Think about how does your willingness to and the desire to use CMC tools affect your daily life? Do you use frequency cards when you're buying gas, shopping at Target, recognizing that that may be tracking your behavior and creating a database? Is that privacy that you're giving up worth the 5 cents a gallon or $5 rebate that you're trading off for? Think about the CMC tools that you use daily. Which ones do you use faithfully? And then even more interestingly, which ones do you use ironically? How do you use them ironically? And why do you use them ironically? And last, think about what your favorite CMC tool is. More critically, think about why it's your favorite CMC tool. This might be your favorite social medium. It might be your favorite video streaming service. But why is it that makes the top of your list for you? With the complete glut of technology we have available to us now, why does that one stand out? And what is that doing to affect your life? So scholars, this is the end of chapter 2, talking about the technologies and uses of CMC. From here, we're going to move on and talk about some of the theories of computer-mediated communication. Thank you for sticking with us this far, and let's keep learning.